Well, we start today's video by saying that the war you're watching around the world today is quite different from all the wars this old world has ever seen. Well, this seems logical by the fact that each era has its own wars with its own characteristics, limits, and visions. Karl von Clausewitz, the 18th century war theorist, said that every age has its peculiar kind of war, its own limiting conditions and prejudices. But here's the challenge, folks. Understanding war as it happens is something extremely difficult to predict what the next one will look like. Then it's almost impossible. Change in wars always comes as a surprise. Look at the 20th century. For much of the Cold War, the concern of the strategists involved was pretty static, preventing a conflict between superpowers from heating up with nuclear deterrence, keeping everything on ice. At most, the battles arose in proxy conflicts such as Korea or Vietnam, which were exhausting but controllable. When the Soviet Union fell, a new era came. In the 1990s, we saw international coalitions acting in specific conflicts, such as the Gulf War or the Ball. The focus was to intervene in situations where governments invaded neighbors or practiced geno. Then came 9/11. The world turned upside down, and the fight against Oti Ponte and Pontinho came to dominate the military strategy of the war. During this period, wars between states took a back seat. What really caught our attention were organizations like Al-Qaeda, and later, the dot state fighting in the shadows in remote places. Now, in 2022, we have a historic turn, the start of the war in Ukraine, a large-scale land war, the largest in Europe since World War II. It's not just Russia and Ukraine that are fighting. We have a giant geopolitical reconfiguration. The United States and NATO, for example, are practically participating in the conflict, providing unprecedented support to Kiev, while countries like China and Iran more discreetly support Moscow. And to add even more complexity, in 2023, Hamas's brutal attack on Israel brought yet another crisis that quickly escalated into a regional conflict involving multiple states and non-state groups. It seems, of course, that we have left an era of limited wars to a time of comprehensive conflicts. It is as if we return to the concept of total war, total mobilization of resources, prioritizing war above everything else, attacks on different types of targets. It's just that now, with new technologies and deeply interconnected economies. So we're talking about something completely new. They want to know how this changes the future of strategies and what planners need to think about for the next few years. So, to understand, it is essential to revisit some predictions made about a decade ago. At that time, numerous experts believed that future conflicts would become quicker, with a strong synergy between humans and intelligent machines. Autonomous tools like drones would become prominent, and both physical and cyber arenas would emerge as the new strategic battlegrounds. Some of these predictions have come true, others have not. For example, drones have really revolutionized the battlefield. Just look at what is happening in Ukraine. There, we have everything from aerial drones launching missiles to things like robot dogs patrolling the trenches. But at the same time, nuclear threats have once again dominated discourse. Ruth has already made hints about using nuclear weapons and even positioned some in Belarus. China is expanding and diversifying its nuclear arsenal, making the global balance even more complex than a bipolar dynamic between the United States and Russia. We are now seeing a tripolar scenario. Now, this is where things get really intriguing. The continuous call of conflict has changed. Before we could categorize the types of warfare into insurgencies having bridge to bridge at the lowest level, conventional wars in the middle, and nuclear threats at the top, right? Today, all of this seems to collapse into a single spectrum. In Ukraine, we have autonomous drones, trench battles, as in World War I, and the shadow of nuclear weapons hanging over the Middle East. It is a mix of sophisticated missile attacks and more traditional confrontations such as gunmen and motorcycles. In the Indo-Pacific, the dispute is at sea and in the air, with military exercises around Taiwan increasing tension. Then, speaking of the sea, this space became more strategic. During the post-9/11 era, most maritime attacks targeted land areas. Today, the seas themselves have become battlefields. You want an example? Ukraine destroyed the sea of 20 Russian ships in the Black Sea and Red Sea. Attacks by groups like ICUs have virtually closed off a route to commercial shipping. And that raises a question, folks. If the United States can't protect the Red Sea, Remember the metaphor of the whale bear? Are they ready to do that in the Indo-Pacific, where things are increasingly tense? Is Alfred Maha's theory of sea power once again being questioned? Well, this plurality of conflicts also reminds us that weapons, which are the sensation of the moment, can quickly become obsolete. Think of 2022, when Ukraine's precision-guided munitions seemed to revolutionize the war against Russia. But by the following year, the Russians had already found ways to neutralize them using countermeasures such as electronic interference. This ends up teaching us that in war, every advance is followed by a reaction, a counter strategy. And that brings us to the important point, understanding the wars of today. It is not a matter of observing the present, but of predicting what will be decisive in the future. We are living in a time when conflicts have not only become broader, but also more diverse. Well, the post-9/11 wars had already shown the disproportionate role of non-state groups like T-DOT, DOT, militias, and paramilitary forces. But now we're dealing with an even more complex combination. Traditional state forces are back, but these non-state groups continue to play important roles. Look at the Middle East, for example. We have the useful, who, despite being a relatively small rebel force, are challenging the United States Navy like no other since World War II. It doesn't stop there. With Iran's help, they are manufacturing their own drones and attacking in the air and sea. In Ukraine, the scenario is equally complex. There, Kiev's regular forces are fighting side by side with international volunteers, something we haven't seen on such a large scale since the Spanish Civil War. Meanwhile, Russia employs mercenaries from the Wagner Group and even convicts sent directly to the battlefield. All of this makes the task of building partner forces even more complicated than it was at the time of the wars in Afghanistan and Iraq. At that time, the focus of the United States, China, and even Russia was to help allies fight threats, bridge punches, and insurgencies. Now, the situation is quite different. Aid to Ukraine, for example, requires the United States and its allies not only to provide weapons, but also to teach Ukrainians how to use cutting-edge equipment in a war against another state. We see the same thing on the opposite side. And look how interesting. The United States needed to form an unprecedented international coalition with more than 50 countries to coordinate the supply of war material to Ukraine. This is the most complex and rapid effort ever made to build the military capability of a single country. Sometimes equipment arrive in Ukraine in a matter of days. Of course, we cannot ignore the political issue, and political decisions end up being delayed much more than logistical problems. But of course, there's always a cost, right? Transferring valuable equipment to allies can impact the military readiness and credibility of the transferring country. Moreover, this assistance is not only technical, it is also political. It is often necessary to carefully decide how and when the equipment will be used, especially to avoid crossing the so-called red lines of opponents, right? And as we've seen lately, even those red lines aren't as red as we thought. And we cannot ignore the role of the defense industries of the war industry. Countries such as Russia, China, Iran, and North Korea are expanding or revitalizing their industrial capabilities to sustain conflicts. What about European countries that have had great difficulty producing ammunition in sufficient quantities to supply Ukrainians from one hour to another? Everyone is concerned about how to create the ideal conditions to avoid or prepare for future conflicts, such as a situation involving, for example, the Taiwan issue. Learning from the war in Ukraine has been extremely important. Strategies such as building regional coalitions, rapid delivery of assistance, and adaptation to realistic scenarios are already being applied to strengthening Taiwan's defense and also to strengthening the Chinese capacity to invade the island. But of course, these actions, at the same time that it can bring stability, can be destabilizing elements, since the expansion of power beyond natural historical limits can end up forming fears and consequently preventive actions against the hypothetical threat that was dealt with expansionism. But here's an important point. In the future, strategists will have to deal not only with state forces, but also as the wide range of insurgent actors, mercenaries, and even commercial companies. Do you remember that during the post-9/11 era, the word deterrence almost disappeared from the vocabulary? After all, at that time, the main concern was groups like Al-Qaeda and the Islamic State, non-state actors that could not be deterred in traditional ways. It was often referred to as a clash of civilizations. Today's scenario presents a stark contrast over just a few years. Deterrence now stands as a key concept in nearly all foreign and security policy discussions across any platform addressing the topic, including our channel. This focus on deterrence arises because we are once again contending with major powers such as the United States, Russia, and China. The concept of deterrence consists of two primary components. The first is what we call denial deterrence. Well, basically, it is to make life difficult for the opponent, making it super complicated for him to achieve his goals. Even if the initial attack happens, the idea is to limit the damage and prevent the conflict from escalating. You want an example? Earlier this year, Iran launched an attack on Israel. And what happened? Israel, with the help of the United States and those advanced air defense systems, was able to intercept most of the Iranian missiles and drones. The result? Space to plan a calmer and more calculated response, but of course, at a price, right? Responding to relatively inexpensive attacks from ICUs in the Red Sea, for example, the United States Navy spent enormous resources on munitions and deterrence operations, failing to completely neutralize the threat. And that begs the question, to what extent are these efforts sustainable? Well, my friends, but now let's talk about such deterrence by punishment, which is that idea of sending the message to the opponent. You screw up, the consequences will be severe, huh? This was very evident in the Ukraine war, when Putin began to give those indirect hints about using nuclear weapons. What did the United States do? They answered quickly. In the can, right? If you do, the consequences will be catastrophic. But it wasn't just in the conversation, because countries like China and India also helped to put pressure, since people who, when we talk about nuclear weapons, self-subsistence, end up belonging to everyone. And this ended up greatly reducing the risk of a nuclear escalation. Remember those famous red lines we talked about? In situations of tension, such as the one we are experiencing, it is necessary to be very careful with each attitude. For example, did you know that the United States even postponed ballistic and intercontinental missile tests to prevent anyone from misinterpreting this? Yes, it was a way to avoid misunderstanding. And when things got tight, like after the October 2023 attacks by Hamas, they sent aircraft carriers directly to the Middle East and gave a clear message to Iran, don't make things worse. Do you see how these decisions have to be quick and accurate? When we look at Iran's attitudes, we can also see the caution of the attitudes and the intensity of the responses. Guys, not everything is so straightforward when it comes to deterrence. Have you ever thought that relying too much on these displays of force can backfire? On the one hand, opponents learn quickly, don't they? They can start planning ways to circumvent these threats, which ends up roasting those threats less effective. On the other hand, this also weighs on military readiness. Imagine us spending resources, too many on one effort, and then, when we need to meet another demand, we are left with our hands tied to respond in other regions. As an example, we can remember the Russian action in the recent uprising in Syria. Incidentally, the peaceful anthem is where a new approach called deterrence through resilience comes in. Analyzing, for example, the actions of the United States and its allies, the idea is not only to prevent an initial attack, but to ensure that, even in the event of an attack, United States forces can continue fighting. At the same time, China maintains pressure so that there is no progress on the other side, and the realization of its One China policy is ready to be consolidated as soon as the scenario is favorable. And it is clear that China is noticing the movement of its main adversary. The use of deterrence by resilience by the United States is being followed by the Chinese closely, and I think all of you have already noticed that Washington is doing this. They are diversifying their military bases, entering new territories such as the Philippines, and strengthening partnerships with allies such as Australia and Japan in Washington's view, bringing stability in Beijing's view, increasing instability. U.S. diplomacy is, shall we say, very aggressive. For example, agreements such as with Papua New Guinea are allowing Washington to modernize local bases, conduct more joint exercises, and of course, work better in partnership with other militaries. And let me tell you, an American nuclear-capable submarine paid a visit to South Korea the other day. Can you imagine the impact of that? It's like he's saying, look, we're here and we're not going anywhere. On the other hand, North Korea realizes that it needs to strengthen itself and prepare for a potential confrontation. Therefore, it is no coincidence that North Korea is increasingly getting closer to Russia, seeking to expand its technological capabilities. There is also strategic uncertainty. It is. And here I would use the metaphor of Xi Jinping's frozen smiling look. Have you ever caught yourself trying to imagine what he might be thinking? So guys, it's not always possible to know how each ally will react if things really heat up. Will they release the use of the bases, or will they get directly involved in the conflict? This doubt is part of the game, you see. You think with me, if a state X does not have total clarity, the opponents, like the state Y, are also left without knowing what to expect. And this, of course, ends up complicating any offensive planning. Now you can see that this is not just about military bases and movements, it is also about diplomacy. Did you know that the United States recently achieved a historic milestone? Oh, bringing Japan and South Korea closer is the rivalry between the two. Guys, it's very old, it predates the 16th century, and today there are more than 60 meetings and joint exercises in recent years alone. This shows that the construction of these regional networks is in full swing, and of course we have talked a lot about this on the channel. Now they have created AUKUS, the alliance that brings together Australia, the United Kingdom and the United States to modernize military capabilities, such as nuclear submarines. Can you imagine what it takes to coordinate all this? And look, the challenge is big, huh? Other actors in the region, such as China, see these alliances quite differently. In their view, this presence of the United States and its allies ends up generating more instability in the region. Keeping everyone aligned is not easy at all. It requires a constant diplomatic and strategic effort. In the end, while some think that these collaborations reinforce stability, for others, they are seen as a factor of tension that generates the need to arm themselves and seek more and more possible and available alliances. Now, folks, how do we prevent these conflicts from escalating into an all-out war? The answer lies in a very important concept: acting before the whole thing explodes. That means strengthening the alliance, investing in technology, but above all, having a very broad vision. Today's conflicts, such as in Ukraine and the Middle East, show how complex modern scenarios are. They are no longer limited to military battles. They are phenomena that involve entire societies, economies, and even the global political climate. Therefore, strategies need to go beyond simply acquiring the most advanced weapons. They should include new and old systems working together, because each piece has its function. And folks, speaking of Taiwan, we have here an example of one of the most delicate tensions in the current global scenario. There he is at the center of intense debates, while the United States seeks to improve the speed in the delivery of military aid and ensure sustainable defense in the long term. We cannot forget on the other side of this story, the Chinese policy of one Chin polit for the Chinese folks. This is sacred, and China's own international relations with other countries are related to this policy. In the 1970s, the United States, a member of the United Nations, and then Brazil also stopped recognizing Taiwan as China and recognized Beijing, so much so that the fifth seat on the Security Council and the United Nations passed to mainland China on that occasion. Previously, Taiwan represented China. This vision promoted by Beijing considers Taiwan part of its territory, and even in the context of the New Silk Road, this policy is a kind of golden text. This whole dynamic adds another layer of complexity, especially as the United States is focused on training Taiwanese forces and preparing the island for real conflict scenarios. But as you know, there's no point just having cutting-edge technology if the soldiers aren't ready. The impact may be limited. And look, speaking of alliances, the relationship between the United States and India also deserves special attention. For years, this partnership was kind of lukewarm, huh? I didn't have all that enthusiasm, but look how things change. The need to counter China has made the United States seek to get closer to New Delhi, even failing to implicate its nuclear program. Does India know this and has taken advantage of it to guarantee a kind of pragmatic equidistance? Participation in groups like BRICS balance this rapprochement with the United States? And of course, New Delhi will not downplay this wink from Washington, but will probably make it clear that it is not for marriage. It's an open relationship. In the end, the global security scenario is the most. At the end of the day, folks, this global security scenario is the most complicated since the end of the Cold War, which we can learn from today's wars. Preparedness and prevention are the keys to avoiding something even bigger and more devastating in the future. May peace once again be the predominant scenario in our world. We're done here. If this video is useful to you, make the comment, share your social networks, give a like, and of course, if not already subscribed, subscribe to the channel and activate the bell so as not to miss the next videos. Okay guys, a big hug to Professor Aram Alves.